The stench of coagulated blood permeated the cold stones of Cayce's castle. It was September 1440, and the walls that once echoed with songs of victory now whispered unspeakable secrets. In the upper chambers, a man with a black beard contemplated his trembling hands, hands that had once wielded swords alongside Joan of Arc, that had received the blessings of kings, that had touched the gold of 1,000 conquests. Now those same hands trembled not from fear of battle, but from the unbearable weight of a truth even he could not fully comprehend. Gilles de Race, once the youngest marshal of France, had become something that defied any human definition. 15 years earlier, in 1425, at the age of 21, Gilles de Montmorency Laval, Baron of Race, was the embodiment of French nobility in its splendor. His slender but muscular body moved with the natural grace of those born to command. His gray-blue eyes shone with a keen intelligence that impressed even the most experienced courtiers of Charles VII. His carefully trimmed black beard framed an aristocratic face that court ladies found devastatingly handsome. As he walked through the corridors of the Louvre, the sound of his leather boots striking the marble was accompanied by the rustle of silks and the admiring murmurs of those who witnessed his passage. Gilles's fortune was legendary even among the high nobility. He owned castles scattered throughout Brittany and Anjou, Machecoul, Tifages, Champtocé, Blaison, each an imposing fortress dominating the surrounding landscape like a declaration of power. His lands stretched for leagues, yielding him an annual wealth that rivaled that of the king himself. Estimates from the time suggested his domains generated the equivalent of 2 million French pounds per year, an astronomical sum that allowed the young baron to maintain a private court of hundreds of people, including soldiers, artists, alchemists, and clerics. It was in this context of almost mythical opulence that Gilles found his destiny alongside a young peasant girl who claimed to hear divine voices. Joan of Arc arrived at court in 1429, and from their first encounter, something inexplicable connected these two seemingly disparate beings. Perhaps it was a mutual recognition of souls touched by forces beyond common human understanding, or simply the fascination that two extreme personalities exert on each other. Gilles saw in Joan not only a warrior saint, but a distorted reflection of his own intense and absolute nature. There frappered 71. In the military campaigns that followed, Gilles de Race became Joan's loyal shadow. They fought together in Orléans, where the Baron commanded the artillery with a skill that impressed even war veterans. Contemporary witnesses described how Gilles, mounted on his black destrier, galloped through enemy lines with a controlled fury that seemed almost supernatural. His sword, forged by the best armorers in Paris, cut through the air with deadly precision, and his war cry, a deep roar that echoed even over the din of battle, became known and feared by the English troops. During the siege of Jargeau in June 1429, an anonymous chronicler recorded in his diary a scene that would become prophetic. I saw the young Baron de Race after the capture of the city, his hands and armor stained with blood, his eyes shining with a fervor that troubled me. There was something in his gaze I could not decipher, a hunger that seemed to go beyond military victory. When he approached the wounded English prisoners, I noticed a morbid fascination in him that chilled me to the bone, even in the heat of combat. The coronation of Charles VII, in Reims in July 1429, marked the zenith of Gilles's military career. At 25, he was named Marshal of France, the highest military honor the kingdom could bestow. The ceremony was grand. In the Gothic cathedral, lit by hundreds of candles, Gilles knelt before the newly crowned king, as the monarch placed the gold-embroidered mantle symbolizing his new position upon his shoulders. The echo of Gregorian chants filled the stone vaults, and when Gilles rose, those present could see tears streaming down his bearded face, tears of glory, everyone thought. No one could imagine that those same tears carried the weight of a transformation already underway, imperceptible yet irreversible. The fall came with the capture of Joan of Arc in Compiègne in May 1430, for Gilles, who had found in his companion in arms not only military inspiration but a spiritual anchor. The news was devastating. Witnesses reported that, upon receiving the message, the marshal suddenly paled and remained in absolute silence for several hours. When he finally spoke, his words were recorded by the scribe Jean Bouchon: "If God allows his servant to be captured, then perhaps God is not worthy of our devotion, or perhaps it is precisely the opposite. Perhaps it is we who do not deserve his protection." Gilles' behavior changed drastically in the months that followed. He abandoned the court and retreated to his estates, where he began to gather a strange court of questionable individuals. Among them was François Prelati, a young Florentine cleric with an angelic appearance but disturbingly empty eyes, who arrived in Tiffauges in 1431, claiming to possess alchemical knowledge capable of transmuting common metals into gold. Prelati brought with him a library of forbidden texts, medieval grimoires bound in black leather, treatises on demonic invocation written in archaic Latin, and Arabic manuscripts describing bloody rituals in nauseating detail. Gilles' personal library, once filled with chivalric works and military treatises, gradually transformed into a sinister collection. Volumes on necromancy competed for space with alchemy texts, while grotesque illustrations of demons and infernal creatures adorned the margins of manuscripts. Gilles himself began to study these texts with an obsession that worried even his most loyal servants. It was common to find him in the library before dawn, his candles melting over the pages as he murmured incantations in languages no one recognized. The first children began to disappear in the winter of 1432. Initially, villagers attributed the vanishings to the hardships of the era. Orphan children often fled in search of better conditions, and child mortality was naturally high. But there was something different about these disappearances. The children who vanished were always the most beautiful, those with the brightest eyes, whose innocence seemed almost supernatural, and all had last been seen in the vicinity of Gilles de Race's domains. The castle servants began to whisper about strange odors emanating from their lord's quarters, a sweet, sickening smell resembling decaying flowers, mixed with oxidized iron. The laundresses reported clothes stained with substances they could not identify, which resisted any attempt at cleaning. One of them, Marguerite Larousse, confided to a friend, "The Lord's garments come to us with stains that seem alive, spreading in the water like blood, but with an odor that makes me vomit. And there are always torn pieces of fabric, as if violently ripped." During this dark period, some attentive observers began to notice physical changes in Gilles. His posture, once haughty and military, became somewhat hunched, as if he carried an invisible weight on his shoulder. His eyes, once bright, developed a glazed and distant quality, especially when he observed children. His skin, once flushed by outdoor life during campaigns, became pale and waxy, as if he rarely saw sunlight. His beard, once carefully trimmed, grew wild, partially obscuring a face that seemed to be dissolving from within. If you have been following these narratives that reveal the darker aspects of human nature, subscribe to continue exploring the mysteries history prefers to forget. Every story we share is a window into understanding how greatness can transform into horror, and how the boundaries of morality can be crossed by minds that have lost contact with their own humanity. The rituals began almost experimentally. Prelati had convinced Gilles that certain sacrifices were necessary to attract the attention of demons who could restore his fortune, for paradoxically, even with his immense wealth, the marshal had begun to spend wildly, financing increasingly extravagant and bizarre projects. The first child brought into the private chambers was a boy around 10 years old, the son of a peasant who believed he was sending his child to serve as a page in the noble's court. What happened that night remains shrouded in mystery, but fragments of information that emerged during the subsequent trial paint a terrifying picture. According to the testimony of Etienne Corillo, known as Poitou, who served as Gilles' personal squire, the ritual involved invocations in corrupted Latin, black candles melting with an acrid smoke, and circles drawn on the floor with substances he preferred not to identify. The boy, initially confused but still trusting in the adult's kindness, gradually understood that something terrible was about to happen. Poitou, in his testimony, recorded by the court scribes, described the transformation he observed in his lord during these rituals. I saw the marshal as if possessed by something beyond his will. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from an excitement that filled me with horror. He spoke to the child in sweet, almost paternal tones, while preparing instruments whose function I dared not imagine. It was as if two people inhabited the same body, the noble knight I had served for years, and something monstrous that had taken possession of his soul. Reports suggest that Gilles developed a disturbing intimacy with his victims before killing them. He would talk to them about their families, their hopes, their childish fears. He offered them sweets and toys, creating an atmosphere of false security that made the subsequent horror even more unbearable. Some testimonies indicate that he forced the children to participate in mock religious ceremonies, where he himself assumed the role of priest in a blasphemous parody of the Christian Mass. The murder technique varied, but always followed a ritualistic pattern. Gilles apparently believed that the purity of the children, combined with extreme terror at the moment of death, created a spiritual energy that could be channeled for his alchemical and demonic purposes. He used silk cords for strangulation, allowing precise control over the dying process, prolonging the agony while watching life drain from his victim's eyes. Other times, he used ceremonial daggers, collecting the blood in silver chalices, which were then used in his invocations. Tifage's castle gradually became a labyrinth of horrors. Rooms were converted into torture chambers, decorated with occult symbols and macabre artifacts. A specific room was designated for the most important rituals. Its walls were painted black, and the floor was covered with stones that could be easily washed. Special candles, allegedly made with human fat, burned continuously, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to absorb any trace of hope or innocence. Gilles' closest servants were gradually corrupted or eliminated. Those who showed signs of resistance or excessive horror simply disappeared, replaced by individuals of more flexible morals or already compromised by criminal activities. Henry Griart, who served as chamberlain during the darkest years, later declared, "The castle was no longer a home, but a representation of hell on earth." The silence was broken only by the screams emanating from the Lord's chambers, screams that we learned to ignore if we wished to preserve our own lives. Between 1432 and 1440, it is estimated that between 140 and 300 children disappeared in the vicinity of Gilles de Retz' domains. Most were poor peasants, children of families who lacked the political influence to adequately investigate the disappearances. But Gilles became increasingly audacious, beginning to target children from more prosperous families, which inevitably attracted unwanted attention. Gilles' physical transformation during these years was remarkable. Paintings from the period show a man who had lost considerable weight, with deep dark circles under his eyes, that gave his face a cadaverous appearance. His hands, once firm and skilled with a sword, developed a constant tremor, except during the rituals, when a supernatural calm seemed to take hold of him. His voice, once strong and authoritative, became a sibilant whisper that forced interlocutors to lean dangerously close to understand him. The extravagant spending continued in parallel with the ritualistic murders. Gilles financed grandiose theatrical spectacles that cost fortunes. A single performance about the life of Christ, staged in 1435, cost the equivalent of a small city's annual budget. He maintained hundreds of singers and musicians, organized gargantuan banquets, where exotic delicacies brought from the ends of the known world were served. It was as if he tried, through excess and opulence, to drown out the screams that echoed in his conscience during moments of lucidity. Alchemy became his public obsession, while ritualistic murders remained his darkest secret. He spent astronomical sums on alchemical equipment, Venetian crystal alembics, special furnaces built by German craftsmen, rare ingredients imported from the East. His laboratory in Tiffauges became a site of increasingly bizarre experiments, where he attempted to transmute not only metals, but the very essence of life and death. François Prelati, his demonic mentor, exerted a hypnotic influence over him. The Florentine had perfectly identified Gilles' psychological weaknesses, his need for the absolute, his inability to accept limits, his insatiable hunger for experiences that transcended the mundane. Prelati fed these tendencies with pseudo-philosophical theories about the nature of good and evil, arguing that only through the complete exploration of both extremes could a soul achieve true enlightenment. During one of his most elaborate invocations, performed in the spring of 1439, Gilles claimed to have finally established direct contact with Baron, a specific demon mentioned in Prelati's grimoire. According to his own later account, the creature appeared in the form of a beautiful young man, dressed in scarlet silks, with eyes that reflected flames without consuming. Baron supposedly promised Gilles not only infinite gold, but knowledge of the deepest secrets of existence, in exchange for a price that increased with each encounter. The demonic demands became progressively more specific and perverse. Simple murders were no longer enough. The rituals began to require levels of torture and degradation that tested even Gilles' distorted mind. Children were kept alive for days or weeks, subjected to physical and psychological abuses, carefully calculated to maximize their suffering. Gilles developed a disturbing expertise in prolonging agony, studying human anatomy not to heal, but to torture with maximum efficiency. His personal diaries, later discovered, and then burned by the church, contained nauseatingly detailed descriptions of his experiments. Fragments that survived suggest a mind that had completely lost contact with any sense of human morality. He categorized his victims by age, physical appearance, and reactions to terror, as if they were laboratory specimens. He developed elaborate theories about the relationship between innocence, suffering, and spiritual power, creating a personal theology that justified any atrocity. The end began with the investigation initiated by the Duke of Brittany in 1440. The victims' families had finally found a collective voice, and rumors of strange activities in Gilles' castles reached the ears of authorities, who could no longer ignore them. The initial pretext was a dispute over ecclesiastical properties, but investigators quickly uncovered evidence of much more serious crimes. The arrest occurred in September 1440, during a carefully planned ambush. Gilles was captured in Machecoul by soldiers of the Duke of Brittany, in an operation that gathered over 200 armed men, a number that attested to both the importance and the danger represented by the former marshal. Witnesses reported that, at the moment of capture, Gilles showed no surprise or resistance. On the contrary, he seemed almost relieved, as if an unbearable weight was finally being lifted from his shoulders. The subsequent trial was one of the first great legal spectacles in medieval history, held simultaneously by civil and ecclesiastical courts. It attracted attention from all over Europe. Gilles de Rais, the hero of Orléans, the companion of Joan of Arc, the youngest Marshal of France, was being tried for crimes that defied human comprehension. During the first weeks of the proceedings, Gilles maintained a posture of wounded dignity, denying all accusations and claiming to be the victim of a political conspiracy. He wore his finest clothes, black velvet embroidered with gold, a silver chain that had belonged to his grandfather, in an attempt to preserve his aristocratic authority. But as testimonies accumulated, as horrifying details emerged from the statements of his own servants, something within him began to crumble. The decisive moment came when Poitou, his loyal squire, was forced to testify against him. The man who had served Gilles for more than a decade, who had shared battlefields and nights of glory, now recounted scenes that made even experienced judges blanch. Poitou wept during his testimony, not from betrayal, but from relief at finally being able to share the burden of secrets that had corrupted his own soul. When Prelati was brought to testify, the atmosphere of the court palpably changed. The Florentine, still maintaining his angelic beauty, but with eyes revealing a disturbing coldness, confessed not only his own participation in the rituals, but provided details that only someone intimately involved could know. He described the invocations, the symbols used, the specific words Gilles murmured during the murders. More disturbing still, Prelati showed a subtle satisfaction in recounting these atrocities, as if he were describing works of art of which he was proud. It was during the testimony of one of the few eyewitnesses, a boy who had managed to escape from Tifages, that Gilles finally broke down. The child, now about 12 years old, described with terrible precision how he had been taken to the nobleman's chambers, how he had been caressed and simultaneously tormented, how he had witnessed the death of other children before managing to escape one night when the guards were drunk. The boy's account was interspersed with details that only someone who had experienced that horror could provide: the specific smell of the black candles, the sound of Latin invocations, the texture of the silk cords, the expression on Gilles' face during moments of greatest ritualistic intensity. As the child spoke, Gilles began to writhe in his chair, his hands trembling more and more violently, until he finally stood up and screamed, "Enough, I confess everything." The confession that followed lasted 3 days. Gilles recounted in nauseating detail, not only the murders, but the thoughts and feelings that accompanied them. He described the evolution of his madness, from the first experimental death to the elaborate rituals of recent years. He spoke of the excitement he felt during acts of violence, of the feeling of absolute power he experienced in deciding the life and death of his victims. More disturbing than the confession of crimes was Gilles' attempt to justify them philosophically. For long hours, he elaborated complex theories about the nature of evil, arguing that his acts had been a form of exploring the limits of human experience. He quoted philosophical and theological texts, mixing Aristotelian arguments with elaborate blasphemies, creating a system of thought that was simultaneously erudite and completely insane. The Church faced an unprecedented dilemma. Gilles de Rais was not just a common criminal, but a nobleman of high lineage, who had fought alongside a recognized saint. Executing him without offering a chance of redemption would be problematic. Forgiving him would be unthinkable. The solution found was a carefully staged act of repentance and reconciliation that would serve both legal purposes and the political interests of the time. In his final days, Gilles underwent a final transformation that intrigued even his captors. The man who had confessed unimaginable atrocities began to show signs of what appeared to be genuine repentance. He spent hours kneeling in prayer, his lips moving in silent pleas. He wept frequently, tears that seemed to spring from a deep well of remorse that had finally found expression. He requested the presence of priests for sacramental confession, and during these private sessions, reports suggest that he revealed even more details about his crimes, details considered so disturbing that they were immediately sealed by the confessors. He asked forgiveness not only from God, but from the families of his victims, sending handwritten letters where he tried to express a remorse that words could not adequately contain. The execution was scheduled for October 26, 1440, in Nantes. On the morning of the fatal day, Gilles wore simple clothes, a white wool tunic that contrasted starkly with the lavish garments he had worn throughout his life. His hair had been cut according to the custom of the time, and his trimmed beard revealed a face that had aged decades in a few months of captivity. The path to the gallows was accompanied by a crowd that had traveled from all over the region to witness the end of the man who had personified both the greatness and the horror of his era. Some shouted insults and curses, others watched in morbid silence, many wept, not for Gilles but for the children whose lives he had taken. On the scaffold, Gilles addressed the crowd with a voice that had regained its former authority. His last words, recorded by multiple sources, were a mix of public confession, moral warning, and philosophical reflection on the nature of evil. He warned the young people present about the dangers of wealth without purpose, power without responsibility, intelligence without wisdom. He described his own fall as an example of what happens when the human soul loses contact with its divine essence. "I have seen hell," he declared, "not as a place of divine punishment, but as a state of being that we create when we completely abandon our humanity. Every child I killed took a part of my soul with them, until only an empty shell remained, inhabited by demons I myself summoned." The execution was carried out by hanging, followed by the burning of the body, a combination intended to ensure both death and the symbolic destruction of any trace of his earthly presence. But in a final concession to his former position, the body was removed from the flames before complete carbonization and buried in consecrated ground, allowing his soul a chance at redemption in the afterlife. Gilles' castles were subsequently demolished or abandoned. Tifoyus, in particular, was avoided for generations. Locals considered the place cursed, and persistent reports of apparitions and supernatural phenomena kept the ruins deserted for centuries. Even today, the region preserves legends about the spirits of children who still wander through the destroyed foundations, seeking the peace denied to them in life. The story of Gilles de Rais, transcends a simple criminal narrative to become a meditation on the fundamental nature of human evil. Here was a man who possessed everything society considered valuable: noble birth, wealth, beauty, intelligence, military courage, closeness to holiness through Joan of Arc, and yet these very qualities became instruments of a depravity that defies any attempt at rational comprehension. His transformation from national hero to monster reveals something disturbing about the human condition: that our capacity for good is inseparable from our capacity for evil, and that the same talents that allow us to reach sublime heights can, under certain circumstances, drag us into unimaginable abysses. Gilles was not corrupted by poverty, ignorance, or despair. He was corrupted by abundance, knowledge, and absolute freedom. The figure of Gilles de Rais remains a dark mirror of medieval nobility, revealing the contradictions of an era that simultaneously venerated sanctity and violence, faith and superstition, beauty and horror. His story questions our conceptions about humanity's moral progress, suggesting that civilization is a thin film that can be easily punctured when the appropriate circumstances align. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Gilles de Rais's story is not the crimes he committed, but the ease with which he managed to commit them for so long. His social position created a protective barrier that allowed hundreds of children to die before justice finally intervened. This forces us to question how many other Gilles de Rais history may have produced figures whose crimes remained hidden behind respectable facades, whose atrocities were buried along with their forgotten victims. The legend persists, transformed by time into a mixture of historical fact and popular myth. Some scholars argue that Gilles was the victim of a political conspiracy, that his confessions were obtained through torture, that the evidence against him was fabricated. But even if we discount the possibility of exaggeration, the core of the story remains. A man of extraordinary potential chose to use his gifts to cause immeasurable suffering, transforming his life into a systematic exploration of the darkest aspects of human nature. Thus ends the story of Gilles de Rais, but his shadow extends far beyond his physical death. In the centuries that followed, his figure evolved from historical criminal to cultural archetype, influencing Gothic literature, inspiring legends of vampirism, and serving as a basis for countless reflections on the nature of absolute evil. Charles Perrault, in creating his version of the Bluebeard tale in the 17th century, used elements clearly inspired by Gilles' story: the dark castle, the vanished wives, the forbidden room filled with horrors. Through this literary transformation, the essence of Gilles' crimes infiltrated the European collective unconscious, perpetuating itself in generations of children through stories intended to warn of the dangers hidden behind civilized facades. Modern psychiatry finds in Gilles de Rais a fascinating case study on the intersection of psychopathy, narcissism, and sadism. His crimes exhibit characteristics that would later be identified in contemporary serial killers: the progressive escalation of violence, the need for absolute control over victims, the mixture of sexual and aggressive impulses, and the ability to maintain a functional social facade while committing atrocity in private. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Gilles' story is its contemporaneity. In an era where respectable public figures are regularly exposed as predators,
where venerable institutions reveal themselves to be complicit in systemic abuses, where wealth and power continue to provide protection against justice. The story of the Marshal of France resonates with a disturbing urgency. Gilles de Rais died almost 6 centuries ago, but the demons he fed remain hungry. They dwell not only in the shadowy corners of history, but in the spaces where power meets vulnerability, where authority transforms into tyranny, where civilization reveals its most primitive and cruel face. The true lesson of his story lies not in the specific details of his crimes, but in the recognition that the potential for absolute evil exists latent in any society, at any time, awaiting only the right circumstances to emerge from the shadows and take human form. Gilles de Rais reminds us that monstrosity is not an external aberration to the human condition, but an inherent possibility within it, a possibility that we must constantly guard against, both in ourselves and in those to whom we entrust power and confidence. On the cold stones of Tiffauges, where today only the wind whispers through the ruins, echoes still the final question his life represents. If not even the highest nobility, the greatest wealth, the most refined education, and proximity to holiness, were able to prevent his fall into the depths of evil,